I'm actually picking up from last week when Tom came on The Unusual Suspects, and he shared a story about 538 polling, but he also made a prediction about something that would be happening with the presidential approval ratings. And just like the wizard he is, he's made many predictions that have come true this year, but this one has come to fruition with 100% accuracy. So I'm going to be breaking down exactly what happened with that. There's a phrase, right? Numbers don't lie. Well, it really depends on who's publishing the numbers, because sometimes the numbers do lie, as is the case with Real Clear Politics polling aggregate. We can go ahead to the first slide, please, Nat. As many of you may know, Tom and I actually ran a political polling show called The Decision 2024, where week over week, we would show you what the polls were looking like for each of the different swing states with regards to Harris versus Trump, who was winning, who was dominating in each of the various swing states. And, there's a lot of people who discredit political polling. They're like, oh, that's not accurate. It's whatever. You can't possibly know who's going to win until they announce the winner. People think there really isn't any type of a science to it. Mm-hmm. However, Tom and I were able to really break this thing down to a science, and we did so by really having three main rules that guided us when we performed our analysis. So, and by the way, we actually came out with nearly perfect accuracy. When you go back and you watch the last episode of The Decision 2024, we told you guys which swing states would win and by what percentage approximately they would win by, and we were accurate on nearly 100% of that. And how we were able to do it was we created three very distinct rules for ourselves when we were aggregating the data. So, number one, we would always look at the sample size and the sample type to ensure it was adequate. So, for example, if I run a poll, but I only have a sample of like 50 people, that's not going to be proper representation of a larger sample size, right? Because it's just too small. You can't really tell. The other thing is you want to look at the type of people that they're sampling. So there's different classifications. There's adults, which just means people in general. Yeah. There's registered voters, so people who are registered, who are able to vote. But the only one that we would ever consider was the likely voters, the people who are actually going to end up going to the polls to cast a vote, because anything else is going to be irrelevant, right? If we're sampling people who aren't even going to show up, who cares? Yeah. So that was the first rule that we created. The second rule was recency. So when we were analyzing this data, we would always look for the most recent polls, because if you're aggregating data that became available 6 months ago, we know how this political cycle works. There's so many things that impact public sentiment and what's going on. So you can only look at recent polls. And then finally is reputability. Okay, and we're going to dive into this in a second. If we could go back, please, Nat, and actually bring this up on the screen. We only looked at the reputable pollsters. So how can you tell who is reputable? Well, you go back and you look who was accurate, who was actually correct in the previous election cycle. So we went back to 2020, and for us, we knew that Rasmussen and Atlas Intel were the most accurate when it came to measuring the swing state as well as the popular vote. That's who we referred to. Lo and behold, we can see that the most accurate pollsters for 2024, very similar, one and the same. Atlas Intel maintained its spot at number 1. Rasmussen came in at number 6, okay? So before I dive into it, just so you guys know, this is how Tom and I really determined, okay, how are we actually going to interpret this data so that way when we give it to the audience, it is as accurate as possible. Now, since the presidential election has been won, obviously the pollsters are polling on different things. Primarily, what they are polling now is the presidential approval ratings. And as we all know, Trump has come out the gate so strong. Some would argue he's been the most impactful president. These first couple of months of his term have been more consequential so far as the executive orders and everything else than nearly any other president prior. And so what they've been doing is measuring, do people approve of what Trump's been doing so far? And, you go back even a couple of weeks ago and you take a look at what that rating was. President Trump was doing pretty well. He was maintaining a positive approval rating as he had pretty much since he came into presidency. However, as you will all remember, last week, Tom came on and he made a prediction. He made a prediction that one of these left-leaning liberal pollsters that don't have any of the qualifications that I just took you guys through would put out basically some BS poll showing a huge spread in the approval to disapproval, basically saying, hey, people don't approve of what President Trump's doing. And as a result of that, when polling aggregators such as Real Clear Politics, RCP, or 538, which is now dead, RIP, when these pollsters put the polls, when these aggregators put the numbers into their site, right, they would aggregate based off of all of the data that they had available there, including these new shady polls that have gone up. Now, there's two polls in particular that have been released by two pollsters in particular. One of them here, we can bring this up on the screen, please, Nat. This is from Quinnipiac. This is a pollster that is actually so inaccurate that it didn't even make it onto the page of the top, I believe it was top 20, top 25 most accurate pollsters from that chart that we showed you guys earlier. And as we can see some of their numbers there, can you read me the numbers, Connor, on the first one? You're a little bit closer.
Let me adjust my glasses here. You want the top row?
Yeah. So it looks like overall.
Okay, so approve is 42%, 89% Republican, 2% Democrat, 36% Independent, 53% men, 32% women. Compared to disapprove, 53% overall, 9% Republican, 96% Democrat, 58% independent, 41% men, and 63% women.
There you go. All right. So that is one example of these approval polls that have come out from Quinnipiac. We can click over to the next one, please. And I'll show you guys another example here. This is from Ipsos. So Ipsos did actually make it onto the page. So they were in some of the pollsters. However, they were all the way down the bottom. These guys got it so wrong, not only in 2020, but also in the 2024 election cycle as well. So they just put out their approval rating too. If we could zoom in a little bit on that, let's just get a gauge of some of the questions that they're asking and what some of the math works out to be. So this statement, Trump's moves to shake up the economy are too erratic. So for example, in this case, 40% strongly agree, and 32% disagree. All right. So these are just some examples to show you guys the types of questions that they're posing to people out there. Thank you very much, Nat. We can pull that one down now. So as mentioned, what these aggregators do is they take the spread, the overall result of these pollsters, they put it into their aggregate. And what it does is it really drastically changes the way the data is reflected. We can see that I believe that was March 9th, Trump was maintaining nearly a full point ahead, approve versus disapprove. And when you look at the trend there, when you look at the lines, we can see that he's maintained that, like I mentioned, pretty much since he came into office. And then last week, BizDoc predicted that these polls would come out. They would be published by Real Clear Politics. And as a result, we would see what we're going to see on this next slide over. Please, Nat. And we can see here that, that is exactly what happened. So Quinnipiac was added in there. And as we can see, that is a negative 11 spread. They're saying that when you take into account the 42% approve versus the 53% disapprove, overall, that is a net negative 11. Likewise, with the Ipsos poll, the approve was 44, disapprove 52, makes it a net negative of 8. Not quite double digits, but nearly. So these are two of some of the most inaccurate pollsters out there that are bringing the entire overall aggregate for Donald Trump's approval rating down.
On purpose. On purpose, obviously.
And what Tom predicted was these leftist pollsters would come out, put out the polls that would impact the aggregate just so what? So what could happen? And he predicted this perfectly. So that the media, the establishment, could come out and post an article saying, people aren't approving of what President Trump is doing right now. So that way they can create a narrative that is supported by the numbers, because numbers don't lie. Except, like we said at the top of the segment, sometimes they do, depending on how it's framed and depending on the manner in which you look at the data itself, right? So exactly as was predicted, we can see that then an article came out over the weekend. We can pull up this one here. And what's crazy is this is actually Fox, which typically tend to be a little bit more right-wing as well. So here's my question. You can see I've highlighted the segment there where they talk about the Quinnipiac poll showing the negative approval rating for President Trump, right? So, guys, tell me this. Why would a right-wing group be publishing a poll that is, an outlier if we're being nice, right? But realistically, this is just outright propaganda. This poll was not conducted properly. It doesn't have any of the proper measures in place that Tom and I would look to when we are deciding whether or not data is good or not. Why are they taking this data, running with it, to then go on and make articles that broadcast this opinion that Trump is not doing a good job and public sentiment is that he's not doing a good job? Why do you guys think that could be happening?
So automatically, yes, Fox is normally more right-leaning, but they're also mainstream media. No, this is exactly why people don't trust mainstream media, and they're coming to people like PBD Podcasts, coming to shows like ours, because you guys break it down in terms of, I just love how you and Tom did that so brilliantly. These are not worthy pollsters who then gave the lowest numbers without any real evidence as to that. So they're manipulating it right on time for the story, for the release that came out this weekend.
Yep.
And that's why I choose to get my news from the people that I work with and not from Fox, not from the mainstream media, because there's more of a journalistic nature to it. I understand it better, and I'm not being force-fed a story.
What do you think, Connor?
There's a rule of thumb that gets thrown around a lot in journalism that I tend to abide by when I report on these things. It's that all polls are fake, some polls are useful. That basically anytime you look at a poll, there's all sorts of bias and improper things, even for the most accurate ones. Sample sizes are usually so terrible. It's turns out 100% of Democrats outside the CNN studio say Donald Trump's a piece of garbage.
Yeah.
And wow, that's representative. We talked to 15 people.
Right.
All of these polls are done for a purpose. Clearly, most of the time, like we saw with this, it's for creating headlines. They want to have something authoritative, and that's, I think, being charitable to Fox. That's why they went with it, because Quinnipiac is known for having that kind of credibility, even though when you do the actual stats on it, they're not credible at all. They have name recognition.
Yes.
So when they put out a poll, people pay attention. Same thing with, all these other pollsters that, we just talked about 538 who shut down. They called the 2008 election, which, like Tom said, who couldn't have seen that coming, that Barack Obama was going to win. But they wrote on that for almost 2 decades, even though every election they kept getting worse and worse and worse. But the name recognition creates headlines that let everybody think they're citing something credible when they write their articles to push their agenda.
Yes.
It's they call it the citation circle jerk, of everybody wants to just reference back to other people who shore up their argument, even though those people are building their argument on nothing, and everybody just references back to something, and you realize it's propped up on nothing. It's propaganda, like you said.
What do you think, Rob?
Well, you know who owns Fox News Corp, who is owned by the Murdoch family?
Rupert.
And there's a book out, even though Rupert was in the Oval Office with Trump a few weeks ago. That's why this is so weird. A new book that's coming out called Revenge, The Inside Story of Trump's Return to Power. It's written by an Axios reporter, Alex Inestat. There's reports that there is friction between Donald Trump and Rupert Murdoch. In the book, do you guys remember, we may not remember this, but when Donald Trump first announced that he was running for president the second or I guess third time for the 2024 campaign, the way that the New York Post, which is also owned by Rupert Murdoch, the way that they covered it, they had a headline, Florida man makes announcement. apparently that enraged Trump to the point where he called Rupert Murdoch a piece of, and I quote, shit, and then also referred to his son, James Murdoch, called him a crazy fucking liberal. Now, this is all according to this book. Again, the book, The Inside Story of Trump's Return to Power. But what's interesting is, when did this poll come out? When did these polls come out?
Just within the last week and a half.
Yeah. Well, this report is from Tuesday, March 11th. So when you ask the question, why would Fox News, typically a conservative media outlet, allow coverage or put coverage of this poll and these results out? Well, there may be friction behind the scenes that we're not aware of, that this Axios reporter has hit home on, which is that there's friction between Trump and Murdoch, which is why a Murdoch-owned entity might put out that poll. And cover
can
that
we zoom in and see the date on that article,
What a
please,
good
Nat?
angle,
Just
Rob.
above the the picture.
March 13th.
Damn,
Wow.
we figured it
that,
out.
I mean, that
Wow.
would, if that's it, that would make it a good case because, bro, you know how Trump is with his ego. But the same token, I understand that. Like, I mean, I think that's pretty much.
Don't trust Axios, man.
No, I don't trust Axios at
they
all.
They suck just as much as the rest of
Oh,
them.
no, they're horrible. But here's the beauty of it is Trump doesn't give two poops. He's leaving. He's done. He's leaving a legacy, and his legacy is just literally a full force tank going forward, bro. And he doesn't dude, shit is bouncing off this guy like it's a bulletproof vest. He doesn't care. He's just making the changes. He's doing everything. We're going to get into the JFK right now. I'm not happy as a supporter for how the Epstein and everything, because here's the thing. If we weren't promised it, I wouldn't care. But Amy, you're good?
Yeah.
Great freaking. That's what I love, because I didn't know where it was coming from. That makes perfectly good sense.
Wow.
Especially when you say a Florida man, because every time you hear Florida man, it's some
bad.
drunk alcoholic putting his foot in a fucking alligator's mouth. It's like, what happened? It's like he doesn't know what happened. So if you like this clip, click right here, and if you want to see more like it, click right here. Stay angry, Patriots.